Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be speaking with Hollis Palmer of Saratoga, who's written 6 books on local crimes that were committed in the Victorian era. Local author, storyteller, teacher. He's a tour leader of the Victorian houses up in Saratoga. He's a publisher. He's done many things. I mean, most of the time on our little show here, we talk to a local author. We talk about a book or two. I got 8 books here, so we got you're quite a busy guy here. I guess my first question is, these things I just mentioned about you, most of them you've done after you retired from the corporate world. Is that
right? I was in education.
Okay.
And when I always told people, when you think you're going to start to retire, you should really start to do whatever you're going to do in retirement before you get there. Don't stay at this magic date that I'm going to stop work and go into the other. And otherwise, you can have a real lull in there. So what happened was, when I was 52, I got into it, started writing the first book, or actually published the first book when I was 52. And I realized that although I never meant to be a writer or a publisher, it was like, this is really interesting. I like the research. I like writing it up. I love the talking. I hate the bookkeeping. But other than for the rest of it, I enjoy it. And I thought, this is the way, I think I'm going to try to do more of this. So then the series of books have come out, and I do that, and I also do some workshops on both the books, and I do workshops on supervision, but that's another from my old life.
Okay, now your books that you're talking about that you got interested in, they mainly deal with true crime, I guess you could say, in the Victorian era, all sort of in the Capital District, sort of from what, here, or maybe up to Saratoga?
Glens Falls to Bennington to Utica, the farthest to the west, and south of Albany a little bit, okay? So that's the area that's involved.
And they're all, like I say, true crime. So how did you were telling me before you sort of got into this backwardsly, but how did you sort of get interested in writing about true crime in just the Victorian era as opposed to, you know, whenever?
Well, what happened, the first story was an accident. I was doing family history, and while I was on it, I stumbled onto, it's one sentence which I actually have memorized. It's from a book called The Early Settlers of Eastern Saratoga County, which I'm sure people have all read. And but there's a line in there saying Jesse Billings, who was involved in the tragedy of June 4th, 1878. But didn't say what the tragedy was, and drove me crazy. So
but you were doing
family history.
Okay.
Because my family lived 2 farms away.
Okay.
So I didn't realize at the time that tragedy was a term they used for murder of a woman.
Okay.
Didn't know that at the time. So I went down and looked it up, and it's like, whoa, this guy's the richest man in Saratoga County. He owns 50 farms. He owns 100 canal boats. He has a canal boat building business. He's got a nice business. This guy's rich. His wife gets murdered. He supposedly has a mistress. When he was 18, he shot his own brother. It's like, wow, where's the book? So I went looking for the book, and there wasn't one.
But all this information you had, it was all like in little
old newspapers.
Okay.
Because I can remember the date.
Yeah.
See, when you go into true crime, whenever you're doing historical, the whole name of the game is dates.
Okay.
So the closer you can come to when something ends, the better off you are.
Okay.
In one of my stories, it started with the hanging of one of the people. And because nothing happens after they get hung. I mean, basically, except for the funeral. From there, I could work backward. Because it would say, we all remember that after she was arrested, back in whatever, and then we give the date, that she had the stillborn baby 3 months later, but nobody knew the father. So, you know, it gives you all the dates. When you go backwards, easy.
Okay.
In one of my stories, I thought I had the end of the story, and I didn't. I had to keep going, and I had to go through the papers for 3 years. I had to go through the weekly paper to trace the story, because the guy won an appeal, won the right to an appeal. So I had to find out how the appeal turned out.
Oh, okay.
So you literally, because this stuff is not computerized yet.
I know.
Okay, you literally go through it,
on microfilm?
On microfilm, and what you do is you shoot to the weeklies.
Okay.
Okay, because the weeklies, at least you got one whole week done. Okay.
So this first, so going back to the first story, that sentence piqued your interest, and then, so what did this lead to?
Well, then I started to read one of the local newspapers.
Okay.
And I thought, you know, this paper thought he was innocent. So then I found a local paper that thought he was guilty. And so I found out that there were 9 local newspapers that carried, before TV and before radio, before we got locked into a 90-second soundbite, they used to run whole columns on a story with respect to it. I mean, whole pages with testimony, who testified, what they said. Pages would be on one trial in a newspaper. It was a big trial. So you could go back and actually start to trace it down. Then you had to find out who the heck the witnesses were, because they didn't necessarily put that in. But at least it gave you a real good format to go from. Well, because the reporters were biased, they would extract the quotes, because they couldn't take everything down. They would take the ones that were biased their way. Then, which was really nice. I mean, that was cool to follow. But what came next was I found out that the weeklies couldn't compete with the dailies because everybody kind of was following the dailies. So what they did is they put color on it. They would talk about what people wore. They would talk about how they behaved in the trial, because they wouldn't put that in the daily. They would just say, so-and-so was called, and here's what they said. The weekly would point out that when, in the case of the first book, that when the daughter was going to testify, the alleged mistress showed up that day and stared her down from the audience, wearing such and such a dress, and how she helped a little child see better by holding her up on her lap so she could see the testimony. And so they put, for lack of a better, the local papers gave you the skeleton. The weeklies give you the flesh.
I know, it sounds like a Dickens or Trollope novel, serialized or something.
Yeah, and that's what they become. And so what I do in all of them since then is, once I find my case, then I try to find 5 or 6 references, different newspapers. Now I know all the newspapers. But once I've got the dates, then I'm able to just go back and look at all the different newspapers to see how they were carrying it.
And this book became Curse of the Veiled Murderess?
No, that was To Spend Eternity Alone was the first one.
This is the first one.
That's the first
To Spend
one.
Eternity Alone, okay.
Right.
So then, obviously, this book, what led, and then you obviously...
Well, what was interesting about that one was in the trial, in those days, the district attorney was pretty much a straight political job. It wasn't really a working job like we think of it today. So the district attorney, when a big case would come up, the first thing he would do is hire good attorneys. He would hire other attorneys to actually present the case in court.
To prosecute.
Do the prosecution. Well, Jesse was so rich that the first thing he did was hire the 5 best attorneys in the area. He kind of weighted the case his way. And as a matter of fact, the prosecution had to get the district attorney from Albany to come up to help him with the case. But when they would run in the paper, they would say, Jesse hired so-and-so, who everybody remembers from. And then they would give another case that had made the lawyer famous. That became the second book. So I went back from
tracing the cases of the people involved.
That's right. The lawyers involved that made them famous enough to be in the first book. So the second book, which is Crimes and Times Journal, okay, the first of the tall books, that one right there, that book predates, in terms of dates, the cases, but they were the cases that made the lawyers famous enough to be in the first book.
Okay, I see.
And then what I started to do, and this was a key for me, is I started to get the obituaries on all the lawyers. And they would always say who was famous for this case, this case, this. Well, they were always their winners. They didn't put down their losers and their, and they're going out. So what happened was that's one of my main sources for what cases to look up.
Okay, so you ended up, you did this one book and
Right.
you found it so interesting or whatever.
Yep.
It sounds like it is just the newspaper. All this was in the newspapers?
Yep.
It's not-
Newspapers, I also go to local historians, and I go
But-
wherever I can to find out all the information.
But no local diaries, just
No.
books, all newspapers.
All
So
newspapers.
Sounds like newspapers were a little more exciting or something.
Oh, definitely. They definitely were, because they were the sole source of local news.
Okay.
There was no radio. There was no television. They were the on-the-spot reporting. The other thing that's hard to get used to is so many people were day laborers that when these trials would happen, because most of my trials were pretty sensational for their community at the time, literally communities would close down. In the Billings case, the very first one, to hold the first hearing, they literally had to close the store. They had to kick everybody out for a while and reinforce the building, because the weight of so many people being in the store was making the floor collapse.
Okay.
Okay, because that's where they held the trial, because there was no other place to do it. And so when you start getting into those, and that's the kind of thing I try to put in the book to show the people the similarities to today and the differences from today.
But you obviously, because we have 6 crime books here, and many of these books are more than one story.
Right, it's 3 of each.
And this one has 3, this one has 3, so there's many stories. I guess my question is, what made you, just a fascination, why did you stay writing in this era when obviously you can
Part of it's the social and the economics. I've spent the last 7 years of my life studying the Victorian era, okay? And to do a story right, you have to be able to tell people not only what happened, but why that was either the same as today or different than today. And in doing that, you have to really understand the other era. Now, I didn't start out as a Victorian historian. That was not where I started from at all. But now I understand when all their depressions were, what was happening with soldiers returning, and so on. All of that plays into the stories when you start to get involved, all right? The conditions of medicine at the time, etc. And so because you need to understand that, I can, and there's enough stories to last me the rest of my life, locally, when I say locally, I mean within a 12-county area. That will cover me for the rest of my life, just tracing those stories.
Well, I think you were telling me you got a whole box of stuff you probably never even get to.
Right. I have. What it is none of my story starts from beginning to end. That's one of my goals, is they have to have twists along the way. And so I have a bunch of stories where somebody got drunk in a bar, shot somebody, was arrested, was tried, and was sent to prison. There's no twist in that. Okay? So therefore, those are just boxed away, all right, and not going to follow. I'll give you a hint of one. There's two that are going to be in the next book, which is called The Ladies Are Back. And it's another. I have two books that are crimes committed by women. One
is Leave It to the Ladies.
That's my newest one.
These are all crimes committed by women.
Committed by women.
And then the next one is?
The Ladies Are Back.
The Ladies Are Back, okay.
And it's also crimes committed by women. Now I'll show you what I call a twist.
What I was going to say was all your stories have a little twist. That's where
That's where I'm going to go. In one of them, the father is convicted of killing the handyman because the handyman assaulted his daughter.
As in?
Okay, back in the 1880s.
Okay.
And he kills him. And so, straightforward story. Wouldn't bother with it. Except 2 days before he was supposed to be hung, the father's mother and the daughter confess, saying that they actually killed the man and cut him up because the guy had sexually assaulted the daughter.
Right.
Okay? So now that's a twist.
I know.
Okay? That's the type of stuff that's what I mean where they all have to have some kind of twist in it. In the book that's out now, Leave It to the Ladies, in one of them, which supposedly was not a crime, according to the wife, who was the only witness, her husband brought his girlfriend home, shot his girlfriend in the head, then shot himself in the head 3 times.
Oh.
Now, most of us would think that by the time you shot yourself in the head 1 or 2 times, the pain would get to you, okay? Now, she was never charged. And the reason was, in the Victorian era, if you killed somebody who didn't really deserve to live, they didn't check real hard into the story.
Like the Old West or something.
That's right, you got it, okay? And basically, his lifestyle was so repulsive to people that she was allowed just to walk.
People were probably happy that he...
That's right. It's what it was, okay? And so that's what I mean by a twist.
Okay.
Okay? And so all of them have to have
all your stories in these 6 books have a little thing.
Something different in there. Yep.
Well, one thing what I wanted to ask you was, because you've been studying the Victorian era, my question was, are these like today's crime seems so horrific and everything, but do you find some of these stories, the story aspect, more compelling because there was more constraints on society, or there was a more rigid social order or social structure? Does this somehow come into these stories?
Absolutely. What the facade of one does. I'm not so sure there really was a more structured social. I think that the rich tried to put that image out there.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure it was really real when you got inside their houses, okay? But what they showed it to the rest of the world was clearly the structure and how we live and so on, which was kind of interesting to follow up on. And I try to weave that into the stories. But I'm not so sure people were really living the way we think they were, okay? I think it was a little bit different. Sometimes I try to show the difference, sometimes I try to show the similarities. One example, again, from Leave It to the Ladies, and this was the one that took me the longest to write. Happens in Clifton Park in 1905. And it's the story of an abused woman who strikes back. And I didn't see how I could write a book about women in crime and leave out the concept of spousal abuse, all right? So I put it in. When I was writing it, I realized that her behavior in terms of defending him during incidents that had happened prior to the night in question.
Like not report, like
not
someone today would not report to the police.
That's right. You know, and telling people, oh, it was just a fluke, it was my fault, was exactly the behaviors we hear about today. So I wanted to put that story. I felt I need to put the story in. But I tried to stress these are the same behaviors we're dealing with today with women who are living in these situations. Okay, so that was that I tried to weave the similarity there, where other times I try to show the differences, because in several of the other stories, the girls were married off at 16 to men almost 40. Okay, and by the time they're 20, they're not the same young woman. And this guy was not what their mother thought he was when she agreed to the marriage, and how you spin all that. Okay?
How many of these books, would you say half the crimes were committed by women?
No, there's only one. The book, leave it to the ladies.
Okay.
Just leave it to the ladies. Well, no, I take that back. And also a book that happened in Troy called Curse of the Veiled Murderess. Okay? And in the book Curse of the Veiled Murderess, the woman that actually is the picture of the woman on the cover from 1852. And in 1852, she was the mistress of the man nominated for governor of the state of New York by the Whigs. He withdrew his name at the last minute. 6 months later, she was charged with a double murder. Okay, of two of her neighbors for no reason.
No, there's got to be a twist if we're going by.
Oh, there's a lot of twists in that one. There's actually that one. I like it among the best. Some people think it's a little bit more detailed than they would have liked, but I don't know how to do it any other way, because I pulled 25 pages out of it. But what if there are 5 sub-stories? Who was she? Because she never gives her name, and she never took her veil off during the trial. Here's what the bizarre thing. It's 1852. No man can touch an article of women's clothing. The judge would order her to take her veil off so the jury could see her face. She'd say no. Because a veil was women's clothing, nobody could take it off, because we had no women bailiffs. Okay. We had nobody to take. At one point he gets angry and he threatens to bring in a doctor, because a doctor could remove a woman's clothing.
Oh. So all this was in the newspaper account?
This was all in the newspaper
account. This sounds really very fascinating.
Yeah. So one is who was she, which I think I really would bet my house I figured that one out. Number 2, did she do it, or did the wife of one of the victims do it, because she didn't have a motive and the wife of the victim did? Yeah. Okay. Was she sane or was she insane, because her behavior made no sense for a sane person? Okay. Then, because it's 1852, the trial's at 1854. It takes a while for the trial to hang, because they try to deal with it politically for a long time. So the politics is all in there. Remember who her boyfriend was. He was nominated for governor. He was a very wealthy man. Then, in between, Horace Greeley runs that series, What a Woman Needs, which is considered the forerunner of the women's movement. And so one of the first things the women's movement does is jump on her case, saying, the Constitution of the United States guarantees you the right of a trial by your peers. The lawyers were all men. 8 lawyers, quote unquote, volunteered to be in this trial. I remember who her boyfriend was. Okay. The lawyers were all men. The judge was a man. The jury was all men. Where was her peers? So they leap on it. Would have been a great story right there. But because it's a standalone book, you have to follow up. That's what the difference between my standalone books and the ones that are collections, meaning 3 or 4 stories in a book. In that one, I started to trace all the lawyers. And what I found was the following. If they named a son after themselves, remember they were all male, that son died violently. If they didn't, one of their other children died violently, or they died violently, and they died as a result of the father's role in the trial. That's why it's called Curse of the Veiled Murderess.
Okay. Okay, so now that's quite the twist there.
Oh, it's an incredible twist. I'll give you one just because it's such an interesting one. The judge was Ira Harris, who became Senator Ira Harris in 1860. He goes to Washington, and he's one of Lincoln's best friends. In April of 1865, the Lincolns are going to go to the theater, and they invite Ira Harris to go to the theater with them. He can't, but he says, my daughter and her fiancé, who happens to be the son of the mayor of Albany, would love to go with you. Most people don't realize that the people who were in the booth when Lincoln was killed were from Albany.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Clara Harris and I can't think of his name right now, but they were in the booth with him. Lincoln gets shot. Most people don't know the rest of that story. They then got married. He became the ambassador to Germany, and while he was in Germany on Christmas Eve, and I've got to do a forerunner just for a quick thing on the book. When the trial is over and the judge is charging the jury, this is 1850, remember? He said, jury, you cannot find her guilty for reasons of insanity because she never showed you her face, so you could not look upon her face to determine for yourself if she was sane or not. This is the rules of 1850.
That was the rule, okay.
Okay, that's why you have to kind of explain these things, okay? So he said, you can't find her insane. The people who were involved in the Lincoln murder, he becomes the ambassador to Germany. On Christmas Eve, he stabs and shoots his wife to death. He gets away and lives out the rest of his life in a very comfortable mental institution because he got away with it for insanity. And it's always a twist that comes back to the father's role in the trial.
Well, one thing now that you're telling all these stories, and the news, it sounds like back then trials must have just been, like you were saying before, the whole town just stopped.
Oh, yeah.
And,
They would,
I mean, I can't imagine some of these trials with CNN or something. It'd be.
That's right. Well, if you could think about it right now, where they carry once in a while the big trials, the bizarre one that just happened with Anna Nicole Smith and her body, and how they got the. Well, people on a very local level, people would just rush to these crowds. And what happened in the ones that involve women, because 4 of my stories involve women, the women would all come from town. I don't know if they were looking for advice or what, but in terms of how to pull off a crime. But they would go to watch these trials real big. The ones that focus more around men, there's more men in the audience. But literally, the towns would close down. This was entertainment, all right? And there were real strange rules at the time. One was that if they ran out of potential jurors, the sheriff would be sent in the street to pull freemen off their wagons and literally bring them in. There are stories in the book about people who were delivering milk and asking for permission just to take the milk down to the dairy. Then they'd come back and sit on the jury, but please let me deliver this before it spoils, okay? I mean, these are rules we don't think about today, but they were imposed at the time.
Well, the thing that I find most interesting is all these little bits and pieces of the society back then, all in the newspapers. That is really amazing. Well, anyway, the other thing is I was going to tell people the way you're dressed here.
Oh.
One of the things you do, you're like a professional storyteller. I know you were at our library once telling stories, and you dressed in the Victorian clothes. You know, your thing fell here. But when you go around and tell your storytelling, a lot of them are some of the stories from these books.
Right.
Right? Okay, so that's another one of your things. Now, the other thing, I guess we could go to some of your other, I think that covers the crime books, but your books are all available. It's at deeprootspublication.com.
Right. Borders, Barnes and Nobles,
and
all the major.
All the local bookstores.
Yeah, they all carry it.
And our library has all your books.
Okay.
I think we bought some and you donated a few. So, one of your other things that you do, I noticed, you give tours of Saratoga, of the Victorian houses. This book's called Saratoga's Great Ladies, meaning the houses. And each story is a picture of the home. But what you were telling me was you don't know anything about architecture. So what would make this book interesting to people?
What it was is about 2 years ago, I was called by somebody and they said, we have 100 buses coming to town. It was some big event was going on. And they need tours. Could you do tours? I said, I've never done a tour. I don't, but they go, who knows more about history and people than you do? Would you do it for us? So I said yes. And then I started to think, well, what am I going to do? I've committed myself to giving this tour. So I went down quick and I started researching the families that built the houses in Saratoga. And what I found was people love it. They want to know about people. I mean, there are people who want to know about architecture, don't misunderstand me, but there are people who want to know about where did the people get the money to build this house? What was their life like? What went with them? So I started last year doing 2 things. I remember the little kid in high school who didn't get his homework done on time?
Yeah.
That was me. So to make myself get my homework done, I started giving walking tours in Saratoga, talking about the history of each house.
These are the ones built, obviously, in this era, the Victorian era.
That's right. Yes, pretty much. Some a few before. Nothing past 1920.
But they're all those big ones that we've all seen up
That's
there.
right. On North Broadway,
yeah.
I do 3 tours. I do one of North Broadway. I do a second one of Union Avenue, which would be the main streets that people know. And I do a third one of Circular Street. Okay. There are other, and so what I do is, and just real quick on the side, I also do for people a slideshow, especially for senior citizens and all, where I jump all over the city because I can do that in a slideshow. Okay, which is
so
kind
you
of
just
neat.
talk about it.
Just talk about it, and I can then relate the family sometimes better. But anyway, I started doing. I said, people are loving this, so I started to record it. And again, because I'm very heavy on the newspapers, they tend to be a little bit scandalous because we don't get our names in newspapers very often.
So you got the same kind of stories from these trials of little.
Okay. Yeah, and or from just incidents that happen. Very specifically, one of the houses, the family was unbelievably rich. She was the niece of Stanford from Stanford University.
Okay.
Her father worked here in Albany, and he was partner with Thatcher from Thatcher Park. okay, and they made the railroad wheels. She marries a guy whose father had built the Long Island Railroad and a whole bunch of railroads. And they lived in Saratoga, and they had some problems with finances. But they did two crazy things that are in, I mean, the story's about 12 pages in the book, but two really interesting things. One was they were the first family to ever drive cross-country via what was called the Southern Route. They drove from here to New York City, so they touched one coast. Then they went down through Roanoke, through New Orleans, through El Paso, and came out at L.A. And they were the first family to ever drive cross-country via that route. Okay, 1990. You think that's kind of cool. Well, they're going across Louisiana during the storms. They drove across the entire state without ever getting out of first gear. Okay, at one point, a group of farmers decide they don't like cars. The first one they ever saw, they show up with guns and make them turn around. Okay, so when you get into those kind of stories, now and then when the father dies young, the mother, who apparently had a lot of trouble with her son, they get into this huge feud. He takes his mother's safe deposit key, goes down the bank, tells her she's not feeling well, gets into her safe deposit box, takes her jewelry, and starts exchanging it with ladies at the night for favors. Now, when you find stories like this, it's much too fun. This to me is just a fun book.
And then this book has how many
I think
houses?
there's 68, because this one is Franklin Square, and then it comes down to Broadway and starts where what's now the wine bar, and goes all the way up to Skidmore College, and then comes back down a side street. So it's kind of a loop.
And
the concept is that you can use it like a walking tour.
Yeah.
You either have to walk really slow or read incredibly fast, but it does give you that reference.
But like your other books, does each house have like a little twist, a little thing about the...
As much as I can. Sometimes I have to kind of work at it. I'll give you an example. One of the houses was built by a sailor, okay, a captain of a ship, and he had two daughters, and they really didn't do a lot. They were really hard to trace, but he built them this house, and they lived out their lives after their father died. They never married. They lived their lives. So instead I focus on the fact that they were quote-unquote genteel women. Okay, something that's kind of disappeared today. We don't have those around today. Women who never worked their entire life. But if you think they weren't important when they died, their pallbearers were the DA, the president of the bank, the president of a golf. I mean, when you start to get into it, and when you realize in one of those houses on North Broadway, the boy who grew up in the house won 5 Academy Awards. It's like, wow. Charles Brackett. He did Sunset Boulevard with Gloria Swanson. He was the writer and director of that. He and Billy Wilder were partners. He did the first Titanic in the 1950s. He did Journey to the Center of the Earth. I mean, when you start getting into those kind of stories, to me, it's just fun. I mean, I think you get the feel for how I feel about just doing it.
I know. Well, like I say, you came to the library once, and you're a great storyteller. So when you're on these tours, you're sort of walking
each one,
and
we go along and tell the story. The problem we can't do in the tours because they didn't build the houses right. I know. You can't tell them the sequence you'd want to. But like one house is built backward. The guy was so angry at the city, which is the longer story. I haven't got time to get into it right now. That when he built the house, and people go by it all the time and think it's a beautiful house, he put the pillars on the other side because he turned his back on the city.
That is,
so when you get into those kind of twisted stories. Now, when I do the tour, I show the people the house, and then that's where we actually end, is looking at the back of the house. We go down a side street and look at it, okay? But that's the kind of fun thing. The only exception to the rule was the new house in Saratoga, the big 25,000 square foot one that the Riggies had. I didn't know how I could ignore a 25,000 square foot house on Broadway. So I wasn't sure what to do, and I wrote a letter to them, and I took it to the security guard, and I said, she can do what she wants to. And I gave her 3 choices. I said, look, I can just put a picture of your house in a quick caption. I can do something about the house itself, which would be fine. I said, I'm awkward about doing the family because you're still alive. And my whole thing is people are, basically it's 100 years old. And 2 weeks later, while I'm writing about another house, all of a sudden the phone rings, and it's Mrs. Riggi, and she said, we'd love to have you write something about how the house was built. So I got to go through the entire
That's in this book. Okay.
It's written very differently than the other ones.
Okay.
I tell people right front, it's almost like a magazine article. Okay, here's the house, here's how it's designed, here's what it's like. But it's more about the house, where all the rest of them are about the families.
Okay.
Because they're still alive and they have a right to their privacy.
Okay.
And I really believe that. Okay, but it was quite an experience.
Well, Hollis, this is quite the. All these stories, I think we could probably go on for a couple hours here. So I'll just tell people, if you go to deeprootspublications.com, I notice your schedule of a lot of your walking tours, your schedule of where you're going to be doing your storytelling at some places, some libraries. They're all in there, and you're going to be at some bookstores talking about your newest books. So people should be able to find out where you are.
Right.
We didn't even get to your book about supervisors, but so anyway, author, storyteller, teacher, tour leader, elder hostel teacher, publisher, all these things. We're really thanks for coming down and talking to us, and hopefully people watching will see you somewhere this summer or wherever, and they can say they saw you on our station. And
Very
to see
good.
you. Okay.
All right,
thanks.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, well, thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again on Meet the Author.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.